Buddhist philosophy speaks of the four invisibles: water to the fish, air to the bird, mind to mankind, and enlightenment to the ignorant. Because, you see, you never know your own element. It's impossible, therefore, to give a definition of consciousness because we don't know anything outside of it. Just as the fish doesn't know anything outside water, and the bird doesn't know anything outside air. We don't know unconsciousness. We only know when we have been unconscious. And so, we are in a difficult position attempting to define the subject of this seminar. We all know what it is, and yet none of us know what it is. We know we are conscious. It's like trying to describe the color of your eyes, not whether they're blue or brown, but the color of the iris, the lens of the eye. We say it has no color. It's transparent, like pure glass. And yet, that might be a color to someone with a different kind of eye. An Englishman and a Hindu were once sitting in the backyard of the Hindu's home. The Hindu spoke about the necessity of a background for the perception of any figure. He said, "Against what background do you see those flowers?" The Englishman replied, "Against the background of the hedge." "And against what background do you see the hedge?" "Against the background of the hills." "And against what background do you see the hills?" "Against the background of the sky." And finally, "Against what background do you see the sky?" The Englishman fell silent. The Hindu said, "It's the background of consciousness." There, you see, we reach a limit. You can debate whether consciousness and reality are the same thing, whether there really is any such thing as pure unconsciousness, whether consciousness is fundamental. As the subjective idealists would say, perhaps there is only mind, and all physical existence is something within that mind. You can debate this subject forever and come to no conclusion. There is no answer when the question is asked in this way. It's helpful, however, to start by making things both simpler and perhaps a little more difficult, by overcoming the traditional opposition between the spiritual and the material. We do this by talking about all things, whether spiritual or physical, in terms of pattern. Because that's all anybody can really talk about. Patterns. Our common sense, influenced by Aristotle and the book of Genesis, tells us that all forms are composed of some substance, just as sculptures are made of stone. But a serious physicist no longer thinks in such terms about the material world. They don't believe it's made of stuff. Instead, the physical process of nature is patterns. You could say patterns of energy, but energy and patterning are the same thing. So, if we use patterning to describe what the universe is, we get something we can talk about. You can describe patterns, measure them, say what a pattern is doing. Although a pattern isn't a thing, it's a process, an activity. So, patterning is what's happening, and consciousness is a kind of patterning, as we shall see. Flowers, human beings, stars, trees, and water are all patterns. Even space itself is a form of patterning. The universe, then, is what physicists would call an energy field. Consciousness is also a field. Think of space as an area in which things happen. In physics, this is a field, a gravitational field, a magnetic field. And fields exercise their influence in non-mechanical ways. If gravity were purely mechanical, you could reduce its effect by piling things up, but you can't. The gravitational field remains unchanged. Similarly, an electric coil creates a field inside a tube. Nothing happens unless you place something like steel inside it. Then, the coil plus the steel generates heat. This shows us that a field is operating. Now, think of the world as a field characterized by patterning, which is another name for energy. All energies, or patternings, exist across the spectrum. Light has a visible spectrum, from red to violet, and an invisible spectrum beyond that, infrared, ultraviolet, cosmic rays, gamma rays. There's a spectrum of sound, and if we studied it, we'd find a spectrum of taste, perhaps even spectra of shapes and emotions. We could even talk about a spectrum of love, ranging from lust at the red end to divine love and charity at the violet end. Friendship and endearment would lie somewhere in the middle. Each emotion could have its own spectrum. The world, then, is an interlocking of spectra, a weaving. Like warp and weft threads in cloth, these spectra come together to form patterns, interdependent and necessary. Take a photograph of a face in a newspaper. Under a magnifying glass, you'll see it's a collection of dots, some heavier, some lighter, giving the illusion of a face. What is the relationship between the form of the face and the grid of dots? Seems there's none, as any face or shape can use the same screen. Or consider the radio. When you turn it on, the announcer doesn't explain the mechanics behind the broadcast. The structure of the radio has no apparent connection to the message. So, what about the brain? Is thought or consciousness a function of the brain? Knowing a lot about the brain's anatomy may tell us little about human thought patterns, just as knowing radio engineering doesn't reveal box techniques. This interlocking of patterns extends everywhere. The book Understanding Media by Marshall McLuhan suggests that the medium is the message, that television influences us not so much by its content, but by its very structure and connection to the world. It's an interesting idea, though not fully convincing. But think about it. Any music you hear wouldn't exist without instruments or a medium to produce it. Similarly, we've never seen anyone think without a brain. Consciousness may relate to the brain as warp and weft interlock, giving form to a fabric. So, what we see is that the world is an enormous web where spectra mesh, creating interdependent patterns that all hang together. The peculiar thing is that these patterns come into existence together, like heads and tails of a coin. The spectrum of consciousness is just one more example of this vast interconnectedness. This fascinating interdependence hints that everything, warp and weft, consciousness and its transformations, arises simultaneously, inseparably, forming the complex spectrum of existence. It's not until you get to the so-called third dimension, although it should correctly be called the fourth time, that anything is physically manifested. Then you're there. Now, you could say these dimensions are quite different from each other. The surface is a very different thing from a line, just as a line differs from a point. But somehow, they all go together in a way that we don't normally think of as a kind of unity. In other words, dimensions don't seem to bear the same sort of relationship to each other as opposites do, at least not in our ordinary thinking. We think that opposites are mutually exclusive, that you can't have something that is hot and cold at the same time. It's either hot or cold. But dimensions are not mutually exclusive. Dimensions are always dimensions of the same field or the same thing. So, then you have to think that what we've hitherto called the mental and the physical, the spiritual and the material, are dimensions of the same thing, dimensions of patterning, dimensions of energy. So, you and hashtag 039 V got this fantastic universe with all these interlocking spectra and dimensions. And this, of course, is the real harp that the angels play when they talk about going to heaven and playing the harp. What are you doing? You've got a spectrum of strings. And when you play the harp, you don't play all the strings at once. That would be chaos. Like when you play the piano, you don't take your elbows and slam them down on all the keys. You select. So, throughout nature, all these spectra that are interlocked are being selected from. That's why the eye selects only a narrow band of the spectrum of light, and the ear selects only a narrow band of the spectrum of sound. Further, through the use of attention, we screen out all sorts of things we don't want to notice. Our senses are influenced by thought, further selecting what we see. This is analogous to plucking the strings of a harp, where you make choices as to which strings you will pluck. So, when the angels play their harp, the music is everything you see. That's the real meaning of what you do in heaven when you go and play the harp. You become one with God, and you create the universe. That's the real meaning. Well, now, what about the spectrum of consciousness? I couldn't avoid designating it. I tried to, but I couldn't. A seven-fold spectrum. The number 7 is awkward. Every kind of phony artist is hung up on 7, and I wanted to get away from that. But I couldn't manage it. So, let's take it like this. We're going to see from one end the dullest dimension of consciousness or band of consciousness, and we'll end up at the other end, the brightest. You begin with number 1, which is sleep. And of course, there are two kinds of sleep: dreamless sleep and dreaming sleep. Number 2 is a state called, and quote, topus, and quote, as in the state of going to sleep or under the influence of alcohol. You feel no pain at all, and your senses are dull. You don't feel like being very active. 3. Waking consciousness. Only, I have to qualify this because the others are awake too, but I mean our normal, everyday consciousness, which we're going to call symbolic. I'll explain why as we go through these in detail. Number 4. Sensory consciousness. Number 5. Cellular consciousness. Number 6. Molecular consciousness. And number 7, we'll just give the name and quote, light and quote. to it. Now, I want to make it perfectly clear that these names I've used are not claiming to be exact scientific names. They're simply suggestive. We don't yet have a science of consciousness in the Western scientific sense. It doesn't exist. That's one of the things we'll eventually have to develop. So, these names are rather symbolic than precisely scientific, and you must keep that in mind. It's rather interesting that this particular spectrum should best be drawn not as a usual band but as a circle, with each as a cut in the pie. So, beyond here is again sleep, deep, dreamless sleep. The Hindus classify states of consciousness differently. They start with number 1, the waking state, number 2, the dreaming state, number 3, the dreamless state, and number 4, called turiya, which simply means, and quote, the fourth, and quote, and cannot be described. They say that when you go to bed at night, you first sink into the dreaming state. Then you go down into, and quote, sushupti, and quote, the dreamless state, and may return to turiya, the fourth. This is why sleep refreshes you. You are renewed. You, as an individual, are withdrawn into the center of the universe, into the Atman or Brahman, the primordial reality, the ground of being. That's why you feel refreshed every night. That's how you get there. You know who you really are deep within, because as the Hindus teach, everybody is truly it. That is to say, the Godhead is playing at being, dreaming up whoever it is you think you are. And then, only at night when you sleep, you go back to being the undivided, one, and only single essence of the universe. Only when you wake up, you forget about it. Why? Because in that primordial state, there's nothing to remember. There's no time, and you need time for memory to work. So, imagine this thing as a circle. At the top of the circle, you have number 7, brilliant light, and the colors of consciousness go right around, meeting again here, here, and here. So, you kind of have black and white next to each other at the top. If we put this in terms of color, then all the other colors connect them all the way around, because, of course, you see black and white are astonishingly creative. You can do everything with black and white. Black and white really contain all color. That's why the Chinese theory of the universe is based on the opposition of yang and yin, positive and negative. The names yang and yin are derived, respectively, from the north and south sides of a mountain, the primordial image. The yang is the south side, bright. The yin is the north side, shadowed. No one ever saw a one-sided mountain. There can't be such a thing. So, in the same way, you cannot have yang without yin.